Before we dive into these captivating stories, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to never miss our latest thrilling tales. I never should have come back to this library, but that book, that cursed book from my childhood, wouldn't let me forget. You know how some memories fade with time? This one only got sharper, like a knife being slowly dragged across my mind. I was 7 when I first found it, hidden in the deepest corner of the children's section. No title, no author, just a weathered burgundy cover with golden symbols that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. The book disappeared the day after I read it. The librarian said they had no record of it ever existing. For 20 years I've dreamed about those pages, about the stories that whispered themselves into my ears that night. Stories that no child should ever hear. Stories that changed me forever. Now here I am, back at the Ravenwood Public Library, as the new night guard. Mom thinks I'm crazy for taking this job, especially since I could make twice as much working security at the mall. But she doesn't understand. Nobody does. I need answers. I need to know if that book was real, or if my childhood mind invented the whole thing. The library looks exactly the same. The towering mahogany shelves, the emerald green reading lamps, the musty smell of ancient paper. But something feels different now. The shadows seem deeper, the silence more absolute. And sometimes when I walk past the children's section during my rounds, I swear I can hear pages turning, even though no one's there. Tonight is my first shift alone. 12 hours of solitude, just me and 500,000 books. As I check my flashlight and radio, I tell myself I'm being ridiculous. It's just a library, but deep down, I know better. Because last night, during training, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A familiar burgundy spine, peeking out from behind a shelf only to vanish when I looked again. The first few hours of my shift pass without incident. I do my rounds, check the locks, and try to ignore how the temperature seems to drop 10 degrees every time I enter the children's section. But around midnight, things start to change. It begins with whispers. So faint, I almost convince myself it's just the heating system. Almost. I've worked security before, so I know all the usual noises buildings make at night. This is different. These whispers have rhythm, cadence, like someone reading aloud in a language I can't quite understand. They seem to follow me as I walk through the stacks, always just on the edge of comprehension. The security cameras show nothing unusual, but they can't capture everything. Some of the older sections don't have coverage, including that corner of the children's area where I found the book all those years ago. I find myself drawn there repeatedly during my rounds, each time hoping and dreading that I'll see that burgundy spine again. The library's history doesn't help my nerves. Built in 1886, it survived 3 fires, each one mysteriously starting in the children's section. Old newspaper articles mention strange occurrences, books rearranging themselves overnight, children speaking in ancient languages after reading certain volumes, librarians going missing only to reappear months later with no memory of where they'd been. As midnight bleeds into 1 a.m., I notice something odd about the security footage. The timestamps don't match up. There are gaps, just a few seconds here and there, but they're definitely there. And each time there's a gap, the cameras facing the children's section go dark for exactly 3.33 seconds. I tell myself to stay at the security desk, to wait out the rest of my shift like a professional. But the whispers are getting louder, and they're starting to sound familiar. They're speaking words I remember from that book, words that have haunted my dreams for 20 years. The power goes out at 2:13 a.m. Emergency lights kick in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. My radio crackles with static, and through the white noise, I hear something that makes my skin crawl. The sound of a child giggling, followed by the distinct rustle of pages turning. I check my phone. No signal. The landline's dead too. Standard protocol says I should stay at the security desk and wait for backup power, but protocol doesn't account for what happens next. A book falls. From a shelf in the distance, the sound echoing through the empty library like a gunshot. Then another, and another. Soon it's a cascade, books raining down throughout the building. My flashlight beam catches something moving between the shelves, a shadow that's darker than the darkness around it. It's heading toward the children's section. against every instinct. Screaming at me to run, I follow. The temperature keeps dropping until I can see my breath forming clouds in the beam of my flashlight. The children's section looks different now. The shelves seem taller, the spaces between them narrower. My footsteps echo strangely as if I'm walking through a much larger space than what's actually here. And the whispers, they're clear now. They're reading from that book, reciting the same story I remember, about a library that exists between worlds and the price of forbidden knowledge. I round a corner and freeze. There, on the reading table where I sat 20 years ago, is the book. Its burgundy cover seems to pulse in the red emergency lighting, those golden symbols writhing across its surface like living things. As I approach, I realize something horrible. The book isn't just sitting there, it's waiting for me. The security cameras might show what happens next if they're working at all, but I doubt anyone would believe what they saw. The book opens itself as I approach, pages flipping wildly as if caught in a wind I can't feel. But these aren't the same pages I remember from my childhood. These pages are blank, except for one sentence repeated over and over. "You came back. We knew you would." My flashlight dies, plunging me into the blood-red emergency lighting. That moment, I notice something I should have seen hours ago. There are no shadows in the children's section. Not a single one except for mine. And my shadow, it's not moving with me anymore. I watch, paralyzed, as my shadow peels itself from the floor like a piece of dark paper. It stands upright, a perfect silhouette of myself, but wrong somehow. Its proportions are slightly off, its movements too fluid, too intentional. It reaches for the book with hands that end in points too sharp to be fingers. The whispers crescendo into a chorus of voices, children's voices, adult voices, ancient voices, all reading in unison from pages I can't see. They're telling my story, not just from 20 years ago, but from now, describing exactly what's happening in this moment. They're reading ahead, telling me what I'm about to do before I do it. My shadow picks up the book, and I feel something tear loose inside. My mind, memories flood back. Not just of finding the book as a child, but of finding it dozens of times, in dozens of lives. I've been here before. I've always been here before. The library hasn't been waiting 20 years for me to return. It's been waiting for me to remember. The shadow turns its head to look at me, and where its face should be, I see pages, thousands of them, fluttering like leaves in an impossible wind. The truth hits me like a physical blow. I'm not here to find the book. The book is here to find me. My shadow opens the burgundy volume, and reality fractures. The walls of the library peel away like wallpaper, revealing endless rows of shelves stretching into infinity. Books float through the air, their pages open like wings, words crawling across them like insects. My shadow begins to read aloud, but its voice is my voice, speaking words I wrote centuries ago. Because I am the author. I've always been the author. Every time I find the book, every time I return to the library, I'm really returning to myself. The stories that frightened me as a child were my own experiences, written down and hidden away, waiting to be rediscovered. The other shadows arrive, now peeling themselves from the books floating around us. Each one is different. Me as a child, me as an old man, me in lives I haven't lived yet. We form a circle around the burgundy book, which hovers in the center, pulsing like a heart made of paper and ink. Time stops making sense. I'm simultaneously 7 years old, discovering the book for the first time, and ancient beyond measure, writing its first pages. I'm every age in between, every version of myself that has ever stood in this library, looking for answers and finding only more questions. The book begins to absorb my shadow, drawing it in page by page. I feel myself being pulled along with it, my consciousness stretching between my body and my shadow like a rubber band about to snap. The other shadows watch, silent witnesses to a ceremony they've seen countless times before. This is the moment of choice, the moment I always forget until it happens again. I can break the cycle, walk away, leave the library forever. Or I can do what I've always done, add my story to the book and take my place among the shadows, waiting for the next version of myself to arrive. I choose differently this time. Instead of letting my shadow join the book, I step forward and grab it. The sensation is impossible to describe, like trying to hold on to smoke that's somehow solid and freezing cold. The other shadows surge forward, but they're too late. I've already begun to pull my shadow back, forcing it to return to me. The book retaliates. Words pour from its pages like black water, forming shapes that lunge at me with paper-thin teeth. The shadows of my other selves try to separate me from my shadow, their touch burning like dry ice against my skin. But I hold on, even as I feel reality trying to rewrite itself around me. That's when I understand the final truth. The library isn't just a place, it's a prison. And I'm not just the prisoner, I'm the prison guard. Every version of me that chose to join the book became another bar in the cage, another shadow waiting in the stacks. We've been guarding something ancient and terrible, something that uses our own stories as chains. The Burgundy book isn't a book at all, it's a door. And behind that door is something that's been trying to get out for centuries. Each time I return to the library, each time I add my story to its pages, I'm reinforcing the locks, but the door is weakening. That's why I'm really here. Not to remember, but to make a different choice. As this realization hits me, the floating books around us burst into flames. The shadows of my other selves begin to dissolve like ink in water. The Burgundy book shrieks. A sound that exists somewhere between the screech of tearing paper and the cry of a wounded animal. Dawn finds me still in the library, sitting at the security desk with my flashlight and radio working perfectly. The power is back on, the books are all in their proper places, and the security footage shows nothing unusual. Just a normal night shift, nothing to report. But things have changed. I can feel it in the air, in the way the shadows behave when I look at them directly. The Burgundy book is gone, truly gone this time, and with it the door it was guarding. The ancient thing behind it isn't trying to get out anymore, because it's already here, divided into countless pieces and hidden in the shadows of every book in the library. I've taken a terrible risk trading one prison for another. Instead of containing it behind a single door, I've scattered it throughout the library, diluting its power but also making it impossible to ever fully contain again. The shadows of my other selves are gone, but now every book casts a shadow that moves just a little too slowly, that sometimes shows shapes that shouldn't be there. I won't quit my job as night guard. I can't. Someone needs to stay here, to watch the shadows and make sure they don't stray too far from their books. Someone needs to guide the occasional child who wanders too deep into the stacks, looking for a story they're not ready to find. Someone needs to remember what happened here. So if you ever visit the Ravenwood Public Library and you see a guard watching you from the end of an aisle, pay attention to their shadow. If it moves a little differently than it should, if it seems to be reaching for the books even when they're standing still, don't be afraid. That's just me, doing my job, making sure the stories stay where they belong. In the books, in the shadows, and in the spaces between what's real and what's written. After all, every library needs a guard, and every story needs a shadow to keep it company in the dark. Finding extra work wasn't my plan for this year, but desperation has a way of changing things. They offered me the night shift at Henderson Public Library. You know, that massive Victorian building on the edge of town, the one that looks more like a haunted mansion than a library. Triple pay, they said. No one else would take it. Now I know why. It wasn't the eerie silence that got to me, or even the way my footsteps echoed through those endless corridors at midnight. No, it was that chair. An ancient leather armchair, tucked away in the reading room. At first glance, nothing special. Just worn leather and dark wood. Probably as old as the building itself. But that chair, that damn chair had a mind of its own. I was doing my usual rounds at 11 p.m. The reading room was empty as it should be. But that chair, it wasn't against the wall where we always keep it. Instead, it was pulled out, facing the entrance, like someone had just gotten up and forgotten to push it back. I remember thinking it was odd, but not alarming. Just some student being careless, right? Wrong. I pushed it back where it belonged and continued my rounds. An hour later, I passed by again. The chair had moved. Not just a little, it was in the middle of the room now. I felt my heart skip a beat. I knew I was alone in the building. The security system was armed. No one could have gotten in without setting off the alarms. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe the floor was uneven. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. But then I saw it, a shadow, darker than the darkness around it, sitting in that chair, just for a split second before I blinked. When I opened my eyes, the shadow was gone, but the chair was warm to the touch. For a week, I tried to ignore what happened that night. I took the long way around the library, avoiding the reading room entirely, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The security cameras showed nothing unusual, but every night without fail, that chair would move. Sometimes just a few inches, sometimes clear across the room. I started documenting everything, taking photos, making notes of the chair's position each time I passed by. That's when I noticed the pattern. It wasn't moving randomly. It was getting closer to my desk. Inch by inch, night by night, that leather monstrosity was creeping toward where I sat. The worst part? The shadow became clearer. At first it was just a dark blur, something you might mistake for a trick of light. But gradually, it took shape. A humanoid figure, always sitting, always facing my direction. I could never make out its features, but I swear it had eyes, deep, dark voids that seemed to follow my every move. One night, I decided to remove the chair completely. I locked it in the storage room and threw away the key. But when I returned to the reading room, there it was, right where I'd found it the first time. The storage room was still locked, the key still gone. That's when I realized whatever was happening wasn't just about the chair. I had to know more about that chair. I spent my days off digging through the library's archives, looking for anything unusual. The chair had been there as long as anyone could remember, donated by the library's founder, Edward Henderson, in 1923. But here's where it gets weird. Henderson died sitting in that very chair. According to old newspaper clippings, he was found one morning, slumped over in the reading room. The official cause was heart failure, but the articles mentioned something strange. His expression was one of pure terror, and his hair had turned completely white overnight. The medical examiner noted that his body was ice cold, despite being found just hours after his death. I discovered more deaths connected to that chair. Every decade or so, someone would be found dead in it, always at night, always alone. The most recent was in 2013, a janitor named Mike Stevens. The security footage from that night was corrupted, showing only static, but his body was found exactly like Henderson's. The pattern was undeniable. But what really chilled me to the bone was finding an old photograph from 1923. It showed Henderson, sitting in the chair, and behind him, barely visible in the shadows, was the same dark figure I'd been seeing. It was watching him, just like it was watching me. Last night, everything changed. The chair had moved closer than ever before, just 20 feet from my desk. I decided enough was enough. I set up my phone to record and sat down in that cursed chair myself. I needed answers, even if they terrified me. At first, nothing happened. For 2 hours I sat there feeling foolish. Then the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air even though it was summer. The lights in the reading room began to flicker, and that's when I felt it. A presence behind me. So cold, it burned. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My limbs felt heavy, like they were made of lead. In the reflection of the window, I saw it clearly for the first time. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, its body made of shifting shadows. But its face, God, its face was like looking into an abyss. Where eyes should be, there were just endless black holes, pulling at my soul. It spoke, not with words, but with impressions that burned themselves into my mind. Images of all the others who had sat in this chair, their final moments of terror, as they realized what was happening. Henderson, Stevens, all of them, they had tried to stop it too, and now I was next. The entity showed me the truth. The chair wasn't just furniture, it was a gateway, an anchor point between our world and somewhere else. Henderson hadn't just donated it, he'd created it. In his obsession with the occult, he'd performed a ritual, binding something ancient, and hungry to this simple piece of furniture. But he couldn't control what he'd summoned. It consumed him, just as it had consumed others over the decades. Each victim made it stronger, more aware, more capable of manifesting in our reality. The moving chair was just its way of playing with its food, a cat toying with a mouse before the kill. I learned why it chose the library. Books hold power, the thoughts, emotions, and energy of countless minds captured in pages. The entity fed on this energy, growing stronger with each passing year. But it needed more. It needed living energy, human energy, to maintain its connection to our world. Through the psychic link it established, I saw its plan. I wasn't just another victim. I was meant to be its vessel. My nightly presence, my growing awareness of it, my research into its history, all of this had made me uniquely suitable for its purposes. It didn't want to kill me. It wanted to wear me. What happened next is still a blur. Somehow I broke free of its mental grip. Maybe it was the surge of adrenaline from pure terror, or maybe it simply let me go, enjoying the chase. I ran like I've never run before, knocking over book carts and displays in my panic. But the library had changed. The corridors stretched impossibly long, doors leading back to the same rooms, windows showing nothing but infinite darkness outside. I could hear it behind me, not moving, but somehow always getting closer. The shadows on the walls reached for me with grasping fingers. I finally made it to the front door, fumbling with my keys as the lights exploded above me, showering me with sparks. The shadow was there, at the end of the hall, its form now massive, filling the entire space from floor to ceiling. The air crackled with electricity and the smell of ozone. Just as I got the door open, I felt its cold touch on the back of my neck. In that moment, I understood true horror, the kind that changes you forever. I dove through the doorway, rolling down the front steps. When I looked back, the library appeared normal, peaceful even, in the moonlight. That was 3 days. Go. I've submitted my resignation, but I can't stop thinking about what's still in there. The chair sits empty now. I can see it through the windows when I drive past. But sometimes, if I look carefully, I catch a glimpse of something moving in the reading room, even during the day. I'm sharing this story as a warning. The entity is still there, waiting. It's patient. It's had a century to perfect its technique. I've tried telling the police, the library board, anyone who will listen, but who would believe such a story? So I'm telling you instead. If you ever find yourself alone in a library at night and you notice a chair that seems to move on its own, don't ignore it. Don't investigate it. And whatever you do, don't sit in it. Because once it notices you, once it chooses you, it never really lets go. Even now as I write this, I can feel it watching me. The reading room at Henderson Public Library is closed for renovations now. They say they're just updating the furniture, but I know better. And sometimes, late at night, I still dream of that chair and the thing that sits in it waiting for someone else to take my place. I never thought I'd be afraid of libraries. They were always my sanctuary. Quiet, peaceful places filled with endless stories and knowledge. But after what happened in that hidden room, I can't even walk past one without my hands trembling. I need to tell you what happened, not just for my sake, but to warn you. Because sometimes the most terrifying things hide in the most innocent places. It started 3 weeks ago, when I got a job as a night security guard at the old Carnegie Library downtown. The building itself was a masterpiece of Victorian architecture, all dark wood and brass fixtures, with towering bookshelves that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows above. During the day, it was beautiful. But at night, when the last librarian locked up and left me alone with nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the creaking of ancient wood, it transformed into something else entirely. My first few nights were uneventful. I'd do my rounds, check the locks, and occasionally browse through some books to pass the time. But on my 4th night, I noticed something odd about the wall in the reference section. Maybe it was because I was bored, or maybe fate was playing its cruel hand. But I saw what thousands of visitors had missed, a hair-thin seam running from floor to ceiling, forming the outline of what could only be a door. I shouldn't have investigated. Every horror movie I've ever watched screamed at me to walk away, but curiosity has always been my weakness, and that night, it got the better of me. I ran my fingers along the seam until I felt a slight depression, a hidden latch. With a soft click that seemed to echo through the empty library, the panel swung inward, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The beam of my flashlight revealed stone steps worn smooth by countless footsteps, despite this entrance being hidden. The air that wafted up was stale and carried a peculiar scent, like old parchment mixed with something metallic. I radioed the main security office, reporting my discovery, but only static answered. That should have been my second warning. As I began my descent, each step felt heavier than the last. The temperature dropped noticeably, and my flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed by the darkness ahead. I counted the steps, 17, 18, 19, until I reached a small landing with a single wooden door. Its surface was covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe in my flashlight's beam, though I knew that had to be a trick of the light. The door opened with a groan that sounded almost human. The room beyond was circular, maybe 30 feet, in diameter, with walls lined floor to ceiling with books. But these weren't normal books. Their spines were bound in materials I couldn't identify, and the titles were written in scripts I'd never seen before, scripts that seemed to change when I tried to focus on them. In the center of the room stood a massive wooden table, its surface covered in open books and scattered papers. A single oil lamp burned despite the room being sealed for what must have been years. Its flame didn't flicker and cast no shadows. That's when I noticed the chair behind the table was pulled out, as if someone had just stepped away. The papers on the table were covered in the same strange symbols as the door, but interspersed with English words: boundary, threshold, keeper, and sacrifice. My hands were shaking as I picked up one of the papers, and that's when I heard it. A soft whisper, like pages being turned, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't quite understand, but somehow knew were never meant for human ears. The temperature plummeted until I could see my breath, and the lamp's flame turned an impossible shade of blue. The books on the shelves began to vibrate, their covers trembling as if something inside them was trying to break free. That's when I saw the shadows. They weren't cast by anything. They were moving independently, flowing like ink across the walls. They gathered in the corners of the room, taking shapes that defied physics and sanity. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The whispers had become a chorus, and I realized with horror that they were coming from the books themselves. The shadow shapes were becoming more defined now, stretching out what looked like limbs, or perhaps tentacles. They moved with purpose, reaching toward me with an hunger I could feel in my bones. The papers on the table began to swirl in a non-existent wind, and in their movement, I saw patterns forming, patterns that hurt my eyes to look at. Something grabbed my ankle. I screamed and spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see, at least. But I could feel it, cold and solid and wrong. The lamp's blue flame surged upward, nearly touching the ceiling, and in its light, I saw them clearly for the first time. They were like holes in reality, shaped vaguely like people but wrong in ways I can't describe. They moved with a terrible grace, and I knew they had been waiting for someone to find this room for a very long time. One of them spoke, its voice like the sound of pages being torn. "Reader," it said, though its shape had no mouth. "You have crossed the threshold. The contract must be honored." The other shadows circled me, their movements becoming more agitated. The books on the shelves were shaking violently now, and I swear I could see things moving behind their covers. I backed away toward the door, but it had vanished, replaced by more bookshelves. The shadows were closing in, their forms becoming more solid with each passing second. The temperature had dropped so low that frost was forming on my skin, and my thoughts were becoming sluggish, as if they were being pulled away from me. What happened next is still a blur. I remember grabbing the lamp and throwing it at the nearest shadow creature. Instead of breaking, it passed right through the entity and shattered against the bookshelf behind it. But the oil spread and caught fire, and that's when everything changed. The shadows recoiled from the natural flames, their forms becoming unstable. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran straight through where the door had been, feeling a sensation like passing through ice-cold cobwebs. The staircase had changed. It seemed to go up forever, and the steps were no longer stone but books, thousands of them, bound in materials. I refused to look at too closely. I could hear the shadows pursuing me, their whispers now turned to shrieks. My lungs were burning, my legs trembling, but I kept climbing. The air grew warmer with each step, and finally, I saw light above me. Real light from the library's fluorescent bulbs. With one final burst of energy, I threw myself through the opening and slammed the hidden door shut behind me. The sound it made wasn't a normal click, but more like a sigh of satisfaction. That was 3 weeks ago. I quit my job the next day, but that hasn't ended it. The books I check out from other libraries now have strange symbols appearing between their lines. I wake up at night to the sound of whispering, only to find my room empty but my bookshelves rearranged. And sometimes when I'm alone, I catch glimpses of familiar shadows in my peripheral vision. But the worst part isn't the haunting. It's the knowledge that's been growing in my mind since that night. Knowledge I never wanted. I'm beginning to understand the symbols I saw. Words in foreign languages I've never studied are starting to make sense, and every night, I dream of that circular room where something is waiting, patient and hungry, for the next curious soul to discover that hidden door. I don't know if I escaped that night, or if that's just what they wanted me to think. But I do know this. Libraries aren't just buildings filled with books. They're doorways to other places, and some of those places were never meant for us to find. So the next time you're wandering through those quiet aisles, pay attention to the walls, and if you see a seam that shouldn't be there, for your own sake, walk away. It was a rainy Thursday evening when I received the email. The subject line read, "Discover secrets long forgotten." At first I thought it was spam, but something about it pulled me in. The sender was anonymous, and the message simply said, "Come to the old Carnegie Library tonight, alone, midnight. There is something you need to see." The Carnegie Library had been abandoned for decades. Rumors of its haunting were legendary in our town. People claimed to hear faint whispers and see flickering lights through the boarded windows. Curiosity gnawed at me. Against my better judgment, I decided to go. I'd always been a skeptic, but that night, something, call it intuition or madness, drew me in. When I arrived, the library loomed like a dark sentinel, shrouded in mist. The front doors creaked open with an unnatural ease, revealing the dusty, decayed interior. My flashlight barely pierced the oppressive darkness, but as I stepped, inside the door slammed shut behind me. The sound reverberated through the empty halls, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. The air was thick, stale, and cold enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. My footsteps echoed as I moved deeper into the library. I kept hearing faint whispers, like distant voices carried by the wind. At first I thought it was my imagination, but the whispers grew louder, forming indistinct words. It sounded like multiple voices overlapping, almost arguing. "Leave," one seemed to say. "Stay," urged another. The conflicting commands chilled me to my core. I reached the main reading room, a massive space with towering shelves and a crumbling chandelier. Suddenly the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the room, cloaked in darkness. I froze. The figure didn't move but seemed to be watching me. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But something kept me rooted in place. I called out, "Who's there?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast emptiness. The figure stepped forward, and I saw its face, or rather, the lack of one. Its head was a void, like a smudged black hole that absorbed all light. My knees buckled and I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. In the sudden darkness, the whispers returned, louder and angrier. I scrambled to pick up the flashlight, its beam flickering back to life. but the figure was gone. I forced myself to move, desperate to leave, but unable to find the exit. The layout of the library seemed to shift, the halls twisting and stretching into an impossible maze. Then I noticed something strange, a book on a nearby shelf glowing faintly. It was out of place, pristine amidst the dust and decay. I pulled it out, and as I did, the shelf groaned and slid aside, revealing a hidden door. My curiosity overpowered my fear. Behind the door was a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. Against all logic, I descended, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the damp stone walls. The staircase led to an underground vault lined with shelves of ancient books. In the center of the room was a large, ornate desk covered in strange symbols. On the desk lay an open book, its pages filled with illegible text that seemed to writhe and shift when I tried to read them. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. In the pitch black, I heard heavy breathing, followed by a guttural voice that growled, "You should not have come here." Panicking, I fumbled to turn the flashlight back on, but the batteries were dead. My phone had no signal, and I was utterly alone, or so I thought. The air grew colder, and I felt something brush past me. A deep, throaty laugh echoed, sending shivers down my spine. I reached for the desk, hoping to use it as a barrier, but my hand landed on something wet and sticky. Pulling it back, I realized it was blood. The laughter grew louder, accompanied by the sound of footsteps circling me. I was trapped. Desperate, I grabbed the open book, hoping it held some answers. The moment I touched it, the room trembled, and an unseen force knocked me to the ground. The symbols on the pages began glowing, and the whispers returned, now screaming. In a cacophony of anger and pain, the book seemed to pull at me, dragging me toward it. My body felt heavy, and my vision blurred. A single word burned into my mind: release. Summoning every ounce of strength, I tore myself away from the book and bolted up the stairs. The library seemed alive, its walls pulsating and closing. I reached the main floor, only to find the exit blocked by a shadowy figure, the same one I'd seen earlier. "You can never leave," it hissed. But as it lunged at me, I ducked and sprinted toward a broken window. With a leap, I crashed through, the glass landing hard on the wet pavement outside. I ran until my lungs burned, finally collapsing on my doorstep. The library's dark silhouette loomed in the distance. I thought I was safe, but strange things began happening. Books in my house would rearrange themselves, and I'd wake up to find unfamiliar texts on my nightstand. The whispers followed me, haunting my dreams. I tried to tell people, but no one believed me. The library was boarded up again, as if nothing had happened, but I knew the truth. It was watching me. Weeks later, I received another email. This time, it simply said, "You can't run forever." The nightmares grew worse, and I started seeing the shadowy figure everywhere, on the street, in reflections, even in my own home. I realized the library hadn't let me go. It had marked me. Now, I'm leaving this account as a warning. If you ever receive an invitation to the Carnegie Library, ignore it. No matter how curious you are, do not go. Curiosity doesn't just kill the cat, it damns the soul. I never should have ignored the warnings about studying alone in Blagan Library after midnight. But when you're a freshman with midterms breathing down your neck, you do desperate things. The old library stood like a Gothic fortress on campus, its weathered stone walls holding secrets darker than I could have imagined. That night, as I pushed through those heavy wooden doors, a security guard grabbed my arm. His eyes were wide with concern. "Kid," he whispered, "whatever you do, stay away from the 4th floor, especially room 437. I laughed it off. Another campus ghost story, right? But his grip tightened. "I'm serious. There's a reason they keep it locked now. What happened to that girl in '86? He stopped himself, shaking his head. "Just stick to the main reading room." I nodded, but the psychology section I needed was on the 4th floor. Besides, what could possibly happen in a library? The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped 20 degrees. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating shadows that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, each sound bouncing back slightly different, as if someone else was walking just behind me. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, just the stress of finals week getting to me. But as I made my way up those marble stairs, my phone suddenly died. All 3 sets of emergency lights flickered in perfect unison, and that's when I heard it. The sound of someone dragging a chair across the floor somewhere above me, on the 4th floor, where no one was supposed to be. The smart thing would have been to turn back, but curiosity has always been my weakness. Each step up those stairs felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was trying to push me back down. The stairwell was lit only by the dim glow of emergency exits, casting everything in a sickly green light. I reached the 4th floor landing and pulled on the door. It was unlocked. Strange, considering what the guard had said. The hinges creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the darkness like a warning. This floor was different from the others. While the rest of the library had been renovated over the years, the 4th floor remained frozen in time. Wooden card catalogs lined the walls, their tiny drawers slightly ajar, as if someone had been frantically searching through them. The carpet was an ancient pattern of faded burgundy, worn thin in paths between the stacks. The air felt thick with the musty smell of old books and something else. Something metallic, like copper. My flashlight beam caught something reflective on the floor ahead. Water? No, it couldn't be. The trail led straight to room 437. I followed it, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The trail stopped at the door, which stood slightly open. A dim light flickered from within. I checked my phone again, still dead. But I could have sworn I heard the faint sound of fingers tapping on a keyboard coming from inside the room. Someone else must be up here, I thought. Maybe another student who'd ignored the warnings. I pushed the door open wider, calling out a soft, "Hello?" The response I got still haunts my nightmares. The door swung open to reveal a scene that defied logic. The room was like a time capsule from the 1980s. An ancient computer terminal sat on a desk, its green screen glowing despite not being plugged into anything. Books were scattered everywhere, their pages fluttering in a non-existent breeze, but what made my blood run cold was the chair. It was slowly turning, all by itself. As it rotated to face me, I saw something that still makes me question my sanity. There was an impression in the seat, as if someone was sitting there, but the space was empty. The temperature plummeted so quickly I could see my breath. The computer screen began to flicker, and words started appearing. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled backward, but the door slammed shut behind me. The lock clicked. I grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The typing continued. "No one leaves until they learn the truth." My flashlight beam caught movement in the corner. A shadow that shouldn't have been there, moving against the light. The chair started spinning faster. Books began flying off the shelves, and through it all, that horrible typing continued. The screen filled with the same message over and over. "Help me find it." I screamed, "Find what?" The typing stopped. Everything went still. Then slowly, new words appeared. My body. They never found my body. That's when I noticed the yearbook. On the desk, open to 1986. A girl's photo was circled in what looked like fresh red ink. My hands shaking, I picked up the yearbook. The girl's name was Sarah Mitchell, a student who disappeared without a trace in 1986. The story came flooding back to me. It had become a campus legend. She'd been working late in the library, researching for her thesis. They found her belongings scattered across room 437, but she had vanished. The case went cold. No body, no clues, no closure. The computer screen flickered again. They didn't look hard enough. Suddenly, the room felt different. The chaos settled, replaced by a heavy sadness that pressed against my chest. The impression in the chair became clearer. I could almost see her outline now, a girl my age, trapped between worlds. The temperature rose slightly, and I felt an overwhelming urge to help. "Show me," I whispered. The yearbook pages began turning on their own, stopping at the library floor plans. There, in Sarah's handwriting, were notes about a hidden maintenance tunnel behind the shelves. My flashlight beam swept across the wall, revealing scratch marks near the bottom of a bookcase. With trembling hands, I pushed against it. The shelf moved, exposing a dark passage behind it. The musty smell grew stronger. Sarah's presence beside me was palpable now, guiding me forward. We both knew what we would find down there. After 38 years, someone would finally know the truth about what happened that night. The tunnel was narrow, forcing me to crouch as I moved forward. My flashlight beam revealed pipes overhead and decades of cobwebs. The air grew thicker, heavier with each step. Sarah's presence stayed with me, a cold spot at my shoulder, urging me deeper into the darkness. About 20 feet in, the tunnel opened into a small maintenance room. My light caught something in the corner, a glint of metal. My heart stopped. It was a necklace, tarnished but still intact, with a heart-shaped locket, the same one Sarah wore in her yearbook photo. Beneath, it partially hidden behind old pipes, I saw something that made me gag. Bones, human bones, along with scraps of fabric that might once have been clothing. The temperature dropped again, and the air filled with static electricity. The locket began to move on its own, rising into the air. It snapped open, revealing a tiny photo inside. Sarah, smiling with an older man I recognized from the yearbook, Professor James Harrison, head of the psychology department in 1986. The pieces started falling into place. The same professor who'd led the search for Sarah. The same professor who'd insisted the fourth floor be locked up out of respect. The same professor who'd retired immediately after her disappearance. Sarah's presence grew stronger, and suddenly, I knew exactly what had happened that night. The horror of Sarah's final moments hit me like a physical force. She'd discovered something about Professor Harrison, something in his research that he couldn't let get out. He'd followed her to the library that night, cornered her in room 437. The maintenance tunnel had been his escape route, and Sarah's tomb. But now, after 38 years, she finally had a witness. The locket dropped into my palm, ice cold to the touch. A surge of wind rushed through the tunnel, and Sarah's presence became almost visible, a shimmer in the air, crackling. With decades of trapped anger and pain, the pipes around us began to rattle. Books flew from the shelves back in room 437, their pages fluttering like angry birds. The computer screen exploded in a shower of sparks. Through the chaos, a new message began writing itself on the wall. In front of me, letters appearing as if carved by an invisible hand. Make him pay. Professor Harrison was still alive, living in a retirement home just outside the city. Sarah had waited decades for someone to find her, to expose the truth. I clutched the locket, knowing what I had to do. But as I turned to leave, something grabbed my arm. Sarah wasn't finished yet. There was more to her story, and she needed me to be her voice. I went to the police that night, still shaking, still clutching Sarah's locket. They found exactly what she'd led me to. Her remains, the murder weapon, and something else. A journal, preserved in a waterproof bag, detailing everything she'd discovered about Professor Harrison's illegal experiments. The case was reopened. Harrison, now in his 80s, confessed when confronted with the evidence. Justice, decades delayed, was finally served. But Sarah's spirit wasn't done. Strange things still happen on the 4th floor of Blegan Library. Students report seeing a young woman in 1980s clothing, guiding them away from danger, or helping them find crucial research materials. The computer in room 437 sometimes turns on by itself, displaying messages of gratitude. Last week I returned to the library, placing flowers in room 437. The lights flickered once, and in the silence, I heard the faint sound of typing. On the screen, 2 words appeared. Thank you. I still wear Sarah's locket as a reminder that some stories refuse to stay buried, that some truths demand to be told. And sometimes, in the darkest corners of Blegan Library, if you listen carefully, you might hear the gentle tapping of keyboard keys as Sarah continues her eternal research, finally at peace but never truly gone.